Thank you, guys. Matt is sitting back there. He's here. And this past week, I noticed Matt and I give each other access to our calendars. And I noticed on Wednesday, on Matt's calendar, it said baby due. And I sent him a text message, and I said, don't forget that appointment. But thankfully, little Hannah came early, and Matt had arranged the band to be on their own today, and so we just kept that in order. And thank you guys for leading. It's cool to see those of us leading, not just the staff people leading, but it's a great model, isn't it, when the staff person can sit in a pew and we can worship anyways. So I'm going to sit down now, and you're going to come now. Brian Harris of Auckland, New Zealand, tells the story of a young boy who went with his mother to a candy store, and the guy who ran the candy store had one of those sample jars out front, for the kids, and he invited the young man. He said, go ahead and stick your hand in and grab out a handful of suckers, and you can have that. But the boy just kind of stood there with his hands in his pocket. And so the man, wanting to be kind, went ahead and reached out and grabbed out a handful of suckers and handed it to the little boy. And he smiled, and he went on his way. And they got outside of the candy store, and his mom said, well, why did you just stand there? He invited you to get a sucker. Why didn't you go ahead and get that? And the little boy looked at his mom, and he grinned, and he said, because his hands were bigger than my hands. As we've been studying Scripture together, particularly the story of Joseph and the story of Genesis, we are reminded many times, aren't we, that God's hands are bigger than our hands? That many times we're better off to just kind of stand there with our hands in our pocket and let God grab out what we need. And this morning, in the story of Joseph, it is no exception. We find Joseph today in prison, and in one of those places where he has to allow God to reach in and do what he's going to do. Now, for those of you who have not been with us, if you're coming for the first time this morning, I'll just go ahead and tell you, we're in this story of the book of Genesis, and we've been walking through this together since the week following Easter, and so we're now in the story of Joseph, and you might have grown up in church and you remember this story, or you've been to a musical and you saw Joseph and the coat, and you kind of know bits and pieces of the story. Let me take just a minute and kind of pull everybody up to speed this morning in this story so that when we land where we land this morning, it'll make a little more sense. Now, you know the story. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, right? And because of that, Jacob gives him this coat of many colors. And Joseph wears it around proudly. And as Bill shared Matt's sermon a few weeks ago, he talked about the fact that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. And so he ends up in Egypt, and his father Jacob thinks that he is dead. And we talked about last week, when he gets to Egypt, he ends up in the house of this guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar's a good enough guy, isn't he? I mean, he provides for Joseph. In time, he turns his whole operation over to Joseph. And Joseph has it pretty good, but there's trouble with Potiphar's wife, isn't there? Potiphar's wife, she wants Joseph, and she invites him to bed with her on a number of occasions. So she's pretty insistent about this deal. But Joseph, time and time again, refuses her until finally she grabs him and tries to lure him in, and he runs away, and she accuses him of rape. And so Joseph is put in prison. And last week we talked about the fact that, he did the right thing, and yet he ended up in prison. He was faithful to God in his actions, and yet he ended up in prison. And today we find Joseph in prison, and today we're going to talk particularly about these two inmates that he has with him, and he has an opportunity to interpret their dreams. And that's kind of where we land this morning. So we're going to read Genesis chapter 40. Chad, come on up. Chad Massoth's going to come and read now. Now, when you ask somebody to read in church, maybe you think you get a verse or two, but Chad gets a whole chapter this morning. But sometimes, and we don't do this every time, but sometimes it's great just to sit back and hear the whole story from God's Word. And let that seep in a little bit. And then when Chad is done reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about this story. So Genesis chapter 40, open your Bibles as Chad reads that.
Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them into custody of the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in the custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Joseph looked at them. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. 3 branches are the 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head, restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve to be put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given favorable interpretation to Joseph, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head there were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket there were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," said Joseph. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him.
All right, thanks, Chad. Leave your Bibles open as we study this together here this morning. So we know that Joseph is in prison, and he is in the prison of Pharaoh's household. Now, this is a prisoner. This is a place where the prisoners were confined from his household. Now, Joseph is a prisoner of Potiphar, so he is there, and it's also these prisoners are prisoners of Pharaoh. Now, we know that in time, and back at the end of chapter 39, we read that Joseph is put in charge of the prisoners. Look what it says in verse 22 of chapter 39. "So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there." And then we're told in chapter 40 that we have these 2 prisoners added to the mix. Now, we're going to talk about these prisoners for just a minute here. The first one is the cupbearer. Now, if you go to school and you have a career day, this one is probably not on the list anymore, right? I mean, we don't really have cupbearers in these days, but a cupbearer had a pretty important job. He had to make sure the king didn't get poisoned, right? Now, not necessarily a job I would want. Would you want that job? But basically, he would take the cup that the king would drink from, and he would taste it. If there was poison in it, his job was over and his life was over, right? But if not, he would give it to the king. Now, maybe people didn't poison the king because they knew it wouldn't get to the king. It'd just get to the cupbearer, and it'd be to no avail, right? So I don't know too much about that job, but that is his job. He's making sure the king doesn't get poisoned. Now, why is he in prison? I don't know. We don't know. We simply know he somehow offended the king. Maybe the king's life was threatened. Maybe he was involved in some sort of conspiracy and they found out and they uncovered it. We don't know, but he ends up in prison. So we got the cupbearer and we have the baker. Now, the baker is very similar to the cupbearer, right? I mean, they both have to do with food, right? Except he is the one who bakes the food, and he also would be responsible for the king's life because people could slip stuff in the food, right? And he would protect the Pharaoh from that. Now, why is he in prison? Again, we don't know. I tend to think there was probably some kind of conspiracy for the Pharaoh's life, don't you think? And maybe the cupbearer and the baker are the ones who kind of are seen as being in on it, and he ends up in prison. I don't think, he made a bad pan of muffins and ended up in prison. I don't think that's what happened. But he ends up in prison, and Joseph is there with him. These are two of the most trusted servants of Pharaoh, and they are there with Joseph. We read in verse 4, the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. So he would have brought them their food. He would have made sure everything was okay, And so he would have spent a lot of time with these guys. They had probably nights they sat up and talked about their stories, don't you think? And Joseph probably told them of his story, and they told Joseph of their story. They probably were pretty good friends by the time these dreams happened. We don't know how long they had been there before the dreams happened. It just simply says they had been there for some time. That's all the text tells us. And then they have these dreams. And it's important to note that the dreams are on the same night. Do you notice that? On the same night, they have these vivid dreams. And the dreams are so vivid that they're rattled by them. I mean, have you ever had a dream like that? You woke up, maybe the whole day, you're thinking, all you can think about was that dream that you had the night before. It's so vivid. The details are vivid. And it says in verse 6 there, when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. They're down. So they've had these dreams, and they're bummed out because they've had these dreams. Now, why would you be bummed out because you had a dream? Why, especially when you read these dreams. I mean, why would that make you dejected? I think there's some explanation here. And before we get too far in the story, let's take just a few minutes to talk about dreams in the ancient mindset, because you got to understand this if you want to understand this story. You see, in the ancient mindset, dreams were understood as a message from the gods. You see, if you had a dream, the gods were speaking to you. And particularly in the Egyptian mindset, this is how they thought. And so they had in this society these ancient dream interpreters. And that was a profession you could go into. Go study dreams, and you could learn about dreams. And in fact, there were books about dreams, these ancient dream books. And so these scholars would study these dream books, and they would be available to wealthy people, particularly kings, and they'd be available to them. And when the king had a dream, he would go to the dream interpreter, and he would say, "This is my dream." And the dream interpreter, having studied all of the dream books, would interpret the dream for the king. That was just how it worked. And they understood the dreams as being from God. Now, think about this for a minute. These two men, the cupbearer and the baker, would have been in the king's court. They would have had access to the dream interpreters. So if they would have had a dream, they'd have went to their buddy, right, who's a dream interpreter, who's also working in Pharaoh's court, and he would have said, this is what my dream looked like, and they would have said, well, your dream means this, right? And they would have been able to interpret the dream, thereby getting the message from their gods. But now, the cupbearer and the baker are in prison. They no longer have access to the dream interpreters. And so now they have a dream, and they have nobody to interpret it. They have a message from God, they believe, but they can't figure it out. And so they're down. They're dejected. That's why they're upset. It's kind of like the cell phone service has been cut off, right? The internet connection is down. They no longer have access to God, to their gods, you see. So that's how they think. Now, notice that Joseph comes to them, and Joseph has a different way of looking at it. Look at verse 8. Or verse 8, they say, they're dejected, they both have dreams, they answer, there's no one here to interpret them. Now we understand why they feel that way. But look what Joseph says in verse 8. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God, capital G. See, that's a different word there. The dreams, the interpretations don't belong to the dream interpreters, Joseph says. The interpretation belongs to God, the true God, my God, Joseph says. Joseph says, tell me your dreams. In other words, Joseph says, your dreams aren't communications from the gods. The dreams are interpreted, he says, by God, capital G. Joseph says, I know that God. Tell me your dreams, and I'll interpret them. So we got two dreams here. Let's talk about each one. The first dream is the cupbearer's dream. Now he sees a vine in front of him, has 3 branches. The branch buds and blossoms and produces grapes. Then he sees Pharaoh's cup in his hand. He takes the grapes, he squeezes them into the cup, and he presents it to Pharaoh. All right, what does it mean, Joseph? He's on the edge of his seat. Is it good? Is it bad? What does that dream mean? Joseph quickly interprets the dream here. He says, Joseph tells them, look, the 3 means 3 days. And within 3 days, your dream means that you will be placing Pharaoh's cup in his hand again. You will be restored to your position. Notice in verse 14, Joseph asked him, look, you're going to be back at Pharaoh's side again. You're going to be his trusted servant again. Would you remember me when you get there? I mean, Joseph understands maybe this is the ticket out of prison, right? And look, he builds this case here in verse 14. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. And in verse 15, for I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Remember our late night conversations? You remember how I got here? I did the right thing and ended up here. You know, my brother sold me into slavery. I've had the bad end of a deal. You can imagine Joseph saying that. So when you are restored to Pharaoh, get me out of here, would you? I mean, you can kind of see Joseph's putting the plug in there. Now, look, I've not committed any crimes. I don't deserve to be here. Now, it doesn't give us the response of the cupbearer, but you could imagine he would have said, yeah, man, I'll let you out. I'll get you out. Thanks for interpreting my dream. Now, I imagine the baker kind of overhearing this whole conversation and saying, well, what about me? I had a dream too. What does my dream mean? And I'm sure he's hoping he's going to get a favorable interpretation like the cupbearer. But his dream is a bit different. I mean, he's a baker, and bakers think about baked stuff, right? So he's dreaming about, muffins and bagels and all that kind of stuff. And he has, in his dream, he's carrying all of this stuff in 3 baskets on top of his head. Maybe that's just how they walked around with that stuff. But there's a problem, and the problem is that he's trying to deliver these baked goods, but birds keep coming down and eating the stuff out of the baskets. That's what his dream looks like. So what is it, Joseph? What does that mean? Joseph says, well, I don't have good news for you. Your dream is not so good. In fact, the 3 baskets, like the cupbearer, it means 3 days. And really, that's the only similarity that these 2 dreams have. Because what this means is that you are going to be hung, and the birds are going to be eating your flesh. Ouch, right? If you're the baker, you're thinking, oh no, hope he's wrong on this one, right? But here's the point. The dreams are fulfilled. Look at verse 20 here. Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. He gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. Now, notice there, colon. He's saying he's going to lift up both of their heads, but he's going to explain this in 2 different ways, okay? Because we know the dreams have different interpretations. Now, first of all, it's Pharaoh's birthday. It may mean that it's his physical birthday, but it may also mean that it is the anniversary of his ascension to the throne. It's very likely that's what it is. And so on this occasion, the king would have had a feast, and he would have granted amnesty to one of the prisoners. That would have been what he did at such an occasion. And so it's his birthday, and we've got these prisoners, and maybe he's deciding which one, he's going to let go, and which one he's going to charge with the crime, if there has been a crime. And again, I think probably there's been some sort of conspiracy going on, and maybe these are the two suspects, and the king's going to decide which one was guilty and which one was not. And so it says that he is going to lift up their heads. Okay? Now, in verse 13 and in verse 19, if you're looking in your text there, Joseph told both of them that their heads would be lifted up, but in different ways. And one way to lift a head up, have you ever seen someone who's kind of down in the dumps and they're walking around, their head's just kind of down like this? And maybe it's a little kid or something. And what do? You grab the kid's chin and you pull their head up, right? You just kind of lift their head up. What are you doing? Look up, man. It's all good. You encourage them. So in one way, when someone's head is lifted up, it's a way in which they're encouraged, and particularly with the cupbearer, it's a way in which he is restored to his position. His head is lifted up. But there's a play on words here in the text. The baker's head is not lifted up, but is lifted off. Do you see that? So it's a play on words here. Pharaoh is going to lift their heads, one up, one off, right? And here's the deal. When they would execute people in ancient Egypt, beheading was a common way that they would execute people. But once they were beheaded, they would then hang their bodies in a public place. It would either be hung by ropes or impaled on a stake, and everybody who walked by would see that person hanging there and would say, "You don't mess with Pharaoh," right? And sure enough, his head is lifted off, and his body is hung, and the birds come and eat his flesh. Now, notice that it's just as he said. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head. Just as he said, the dreams are interpreted. And here's the point here in the text. The point is that the dreams are accurately interpreted by Joseph. Do you notice that? The head's being lifted off, just as he said. The cupbearer's head is lifted up. The baker's head is lifted off. And this whole deal is going to set the stage for the next part of the story. But before we get there, I just want to say, it's not by luck that Joseph's doing this. It's not like Joseph's going, 3 baskets, 3 days, okay, and just kind of guessing at this deal. It's not at all like that. You see, God is empowering Joseph to interpret these dreams. He's empowering Joseph with all of the knowledge, and later we'll see even more knowledge than the professional dream interpreters. Joseph is accurately interpreting the dreams. He's participating in this way. And next week we're going to see how this deal works out. Next week we're going to see how Joseph's interpretation of this dream is going to lead to his getting out of prison. But before we get there, we're going to stop here, because the story today doesn't end with Joseph getting out of prison. Now, we ask ourselves, and you might ask yourself, what does this mean for us? What does this story teach us? What's kind of like the thing we need to hear this morning and apply to our lives? And I think it's a two-part thing here. And the first part, I think, has to do with God's provision. You see, God is providing for Joseph. I mean, he's setting the stage here to rescue him out of prison, to place him in this place of leadership in which he's going to bring the brothers back. It's a cool story. So show up next week. It's going to be cool. But he's setting the stage for that. When we read in chapter 39, 4 times we read the phrase, what? The Lord is with Joseph. 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 And so now he's tangibly with him, empowering him to interpret dreams of these officials accurately. Not just wild guesses, but accurately. God is tangibly providing for Joseph his rescue. So God's provision, I think, is a theme here that we see. God is with him. But the second part of the story, and the second, I think, application to me and you is not yet, right? What's the last verse say in this chapter? What does it say? And the cupbearer The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now, let that verse sit on you for just a minute. I don't know about you, but if I'm Joseph, I'm thinking, holy cow, God just empowered me to come into contact with two of Pharaoh's officials. He empowered me to interpret their dreams, and I nailed it. God nailed it through me, right? That's what Joseph's got to be thinking. I mean, this guy was restored. The dreams were perfect. God gave me the ability to do that. And now the chief cupbearer is going to be right beside Pharaoh. He's going to have a chance to plead my case, and I'm going to get out of prison. You got to think Joseph's thinking that, right? But that is not how it turned out. The guy forgot him. And Joseph's still in prison. And he's got to be thinking, what's going to happen now, right? We learn for 2 years, Joseph remains in prison. Now, that must have been a long 2 years, don't you think? And, you know, you and I know the end of the story, right? We know how it's going to work out. We're like, oh, it's all good. Joseph's fine. 2 years, nothing, right? But living in prison for 2 years, thinking you're going to rot there, had to be pretty tough on him, don't you think? But God wasn't ready yet for Joseph to be out of prison. God wasn't done yet. God was still doing stuff in Joseph's life. And I'm convinced that by the time Joseph is lifted out of prison and placed in this position with Pharaoh, he's ready. But it would require him being in prison for 2 years to get him ready. And I think for many of us, as we walk with God, as we go through life, you know, we want God to act and move now, don't we? We want him to do what he's doing now. And maybe we're in a season in life, maybe you're in a season in life when you're still in that 2-year waiting period. And you want God to move. You want things to turn. You want that job to come now. You want this part of your body to be healed now. You want God to move quickly and fast. And he's not. And maybe this morning you're frustrated. And maybe this morning we can read this story and be reminded that God's timing is perfect. That God does things at just the right time. God does what he's going to do when he wants to do it. And maybe this morning we would be reminded, just as the title of the sermon is about trusting God's timing. So I don't know where this story hits you this morning. I don't know what's going on in your life that God is applying this story to your life. It's a reminder, though, isn't it? That like the candy store owner, God's hands are bigger than our hands. And whatever's happening in your life this morning, trust him in that. Don't give up on him. He's faithful. He's going to provide. He's going to do what he's going to do. And many times we are required to trust, to wait. And when the dude's by Pharaoh doing his thing and you're still rotting in prison, God's not done. God's not finished. We're going to take a few minutes to respond this morning. We're going to invite you to respond in whatever way you'd like to respond this morning. Maybe this morning you'd like to come and join the church. Maybe you've been thinking about that for some time. I'll be standing down front if you'd like to walk down and make that official step. Maybe this morning God would be speaking to your heart in some way and you just need to come and pray. Several of you did that last week, and maybe you just need to do that again. Or others of you need to do that. The altar is open for you now. So let's stand together and sing.